Miyamoto Musashi is one of the most famous samurai to ever exist. He was an incredible swordsman and he is widely regarded as the best duelist in all of Japanese history. He held the incredible record of 62 undefeated duels, which no other samurai in history was ever able to surpass. The closest one was a samurai named Ito Itosai, achieving 33 victories in duels. And even as impressive as that is roughly half the amount of victories that Musashi has under his own belt. Musashi is also very famous for his teachings, his philosophy, his way of thinking, and for authoring the incredible Book of Five Rings, which happens to sit right next to my fireplace. He is considered a kensei, which is an honorary title given to the best swordsman in Japan and literally translates to sword saint. He was also very famous for his dual wielding technique, where he would use two blades at once during combat, adding even more to the legend behind this man. He definitely is one of the coolest characters in Japanese history. In my opinion, the only one that even comes close is Hattori Hanzo. Unlike Hanzo, who mostly operated in the capacity of a shinobi, and by virtue of his work, we simply don't know everything that it is that he actually did, probably per design. Musashi's life and his accomplishments are a lot more well documented. He was at certain points a ronin and a samurai, whereas Hanzo was a shinobi, an assassin, a spy. For that reason, based on their different lines of work, it's not surprising to me that Musashi's life is much more well documented. We know a lot more about him. So we'll start this video off by going over who Musashi was, his life, his accomplishments, and why exactly it is that he's so famous. We will then move on to his philosophy, and finally we'll finish by discussing the Book of Five Rings. So Musashi was a samurai who lived in Japan between the years 1584 and 1645. As we have already discussed earlier, he was a very famous and renowned swordsman, but he was also a strategist, an artist, and a writer. Musashi began his career as a soldier pretty early in life because we know that at the age of 13, he killed another man in single combat. He was also pretty famous for being a ronin, a masterless samurai. This happened in the 1600s when he was on the losing side of the Battle of Sekigahara, which is the battle that paved the way to establish the Tokugawa shogunate. That's the point where he became a ronin. He's kind of the one that has inspired this whole masterless wandering samurai vibe that we've seen adopted in so many shows, animes, and whatnot, because in essence, that's basically what he was. He was a masterless samurai that just kind of wandered around perfecting the art of the duel, and that's what he did for many years. And as we discussed earlier, Musashi was a prodigy since he was a little kid. He wins his first duel at the age of 13 against a man named Arima Kihei. He then goes on to win his second duel at the age of 16 against a swordsman named Tadashima Akiyama. He then goes on to win his third duel in Kyoto at the age of 21, where he defeated several students of a famous sword fighting school. The reason why he did this, a lot of it had to do with his philosophy and his religion. He was a Buddhist, and later we'll get more into this, but he was basically trying to achieve nirvana or satori, paradise, through the art of the duel. He was so focused and determined on this that the entire way which he conducted himself and went about his life, everything revolved around mastering the art of the duel for this reason. This is also the reason why Musashi never got married. He never had kids. He believed that lust would get in the way of achieving this goal and this focus of mastering the art of the duel. He felt like all these worldly concerns and lust and different things that are important to many people were kind of just distractions that would get in the way of him achieving paradise, of him achieving nirvana. So he lived a very strict and disciplined life with literally no other goals. Later on in life, in 1608, it's reported that Musashi met with Mizuno Kutsunari, who was a Tokugawa general. Musashi then teaches this general the secret techniques of his sword style, and I've heard different reasons as far as to why he did that, one of them being that this general befriended Musashi, but the more likely one is that he got hired to do so. Later on, under unclear circumstances, Musashi gets challenged to another duel by a swordsman named Sasaki Kojiro, and this is a very famous duel. So Musashi accepts this challenge, and the duel is scheduled to take place 1 year from that date at a specific island, the island of Ganryu. So after 1 year, it finally comes time for this duel, and the island is filled with spectators that want to watch this. Kojiro, Musashi's opponent, is very famously armed with a nodachi, which is a giant sword. It's basically a giant katana. So as all these spectators and his opponent are waiting, Musashi deliberately shows up late. And to then add insult to injury, Musashi doesn't even show up with a sword, he shows up with a stick. More specifically, he shows up with a bokken, which is a training wooden sword that he carved off of an oar, which is the row of the boat. So basically, on his way to this duel, while he was getting to this island, he took the row off of a boat and a knife and carved a sword out of it, and that's what he used to duel. So when he finally gets to the island and is very late, Kojiro's mad. He's insulting him, there's a little bit of banter back and forth, and it's said that Musashi simply replied very calmly to the banter. We don't know exactly why he showed up so late for this duel, we just know that it was deliberate. Maybe it was just done to cause his opponent to lose composure, not duel as well, be distracted because they're mad. Maybe it was done as an insult to show a lack of respect, further illustrated by the fact that he's dueling with a stick against another samurai with a sword. Again, as I had mentioned earlier, the circumstances surrounding this challenge aren't clear, so it could have been that Kojiro insulted Musashi or pissed him off in some way that he wanted to humiliate him. However, what we do know for a fact is that this duel ended very shortly because Musashi was able to instantly kill Kojiro by crushing his skull with a vertical strike to his head. In other words, Musashi whacked him with a stick and killed him pretty quick into the duel, and that was it. This 1 year of preparation and 1 year of waiting and all these spectators and this incredible duel that was going to take place in this island ended pretty unceremoniously with a whack of a stick to the head. And that's kind of the end of the story of this duel. There's not that much more to it. The guy just died that way. Following these events, in 1614, it is believed that Musashi served under the Tokugawa army in the siege of Osaka. It is also said that Musashi acted as a bodyguard or a retainer for Mizuno Katsutoshi. After the siege of Osaka, not a whole lot happens, and Musashi engages in very few duels during this period. Although in 1634, one duel does in fact happen, and Musashi does defeat a land specialist named Takada Matabei. Musashi then officially becomes a retainer of one of the Hosokawa lords in 1640, so he becomes a bodyguard. There's a lot of talk on the internet because of events that shall not be mentioned in this video that say that retainers were not real samurai or that retainers were a job of not much importance. When you hear people say that, keep in mind that Musashi, probably the most famous samurai in history, was a retainer himself. And even Hanzo, who we discussed earlier, was often operating in the capacity of a retainer also. So this idea that bodyguards and retainers are not of importance and are not real samurai is very misinformed. To be the retainer or bodyguard of a lord or a daimyo or the shogun himself is a role of extreme importance. They don't choose just any samurai to be their personal bodyguard. They will in fact usually choose some of the best samurai to be their retainers because they're trusting them with their life. And not only that, somebody that is of confidence as well, somebody of importance. Moving on, in 1641, Musashi finally writes what then becomes the basis for the Book of Five Rings. Unfortunately, following these events in 1642, Musashi starts suffering from attacks of neuralgia, which if you don't know what this is, I'll read it here for you. Neuralgia is a pain in the distribution of a nerve or nerve, so he started getting nerve pains. Now aware of his deteriorating health, in 1643, Musashi retires to a cave called Reigando, and he becomes a hermit, and this is when he writes the famous Book of Five Rings. As Musashi gets sicker and he starts sensing his impending death, he retires all of his worldly possessions and passes on the manuscripts of the Book of Five Rings to his closest disciple. He then passes away in this same cave sometime in June of 1645, and the moment of his death is described as following. At the moment of his death, he had himself raised up. He had his belt tightened and his wakizashi put in it. He seated himself with one knee vertically raised, holding the sword with his left hand and the cane in his right hand. He died in this posture at the age of 62. Miyamoto Musashi died in 1645 after allegedly suffering from lung cancer. Regarding his personal life, it is said that Musashi was not only in pursuit of the mastery of the sword or warfare, but also the mastery of many other art forms. Writings on Musashi's life rarely mention his relationship with women, and often when they do, Musashi is regularly depicted as rejecting sexual advances in favor of focusing on his swordsmanship. Musashi created and refined a two-sword kenjutsu technique called Niten Ichi, which translates to two heavens as one, or Nitoichi, which translates to two swords as one. In this technique, the swordsman uses both a large sword and a companion sword at the same time, also known as the katana and the wakizashi. So really quick to explain this, just in case you're not familiar with these weapons, the katana is the larger Japanese samurai sword, and the wakizashi is a much smaller blade, almost like a dagger. Oftentimes people think that Musashi was using two long swords at once, like traditionally we see in movies and things like that, somebody dual wielding two swords of the same size. That wasn't quite the case. So now finally, we will discuss Musashi's philosophy and teachings that have been passed down to us through the Book of Five Rings, which is still very famous till this day. So what exactly is the Book of Five Rings, and what does it try to teach us? Well, the answer is a lot more than I can cover on this video, so if you're interested in this subject, I highly recommend that you go read the book for yourself. It's very interesting. But for the purposes of this video, we will be going over the Book of Earth, which contains the more practical or worldly advice and principles. This book contains 9 principles, which are not all the principles that Musashi tries to teach in the book. There are other things that he goes over as well, but I wanted to focus specifically on these again because they're a little bit more practical. Number 1, do not think dishonestly. You will notice that throughout this book, a lot of the teachings and the philosophy are very Buddhist in nature. So if you're familiar with that religion and that way of thinking, a lot of this will be familiar to you, but I'll explain. Although if you were to ask me where I fall religiously, I would probably answer to you that I'm agnostic, but realistically speaking, I probably fall somewhere between Buddhist and Hindu. So I'm very familiar with these principles and ideas, and although some of them might seem, straightforward or they don't make a lot of sense, hopefully I can try to kind of explain where he's probably coming from with what he's saying. So on number 1 here, where he says, do not think dishonestly, you might think, just looking at this, okay, be an honest person. That's not quite what he means. In Buddhism, there is something called the ego. It is believed that all humans are essentially possessed by a shadow self, which is your ego, that clouds your judgment, it clouds your thoughts. A lot of times in our life, we might be thinking dishonestly without even realizing it, and it's often because of this so-called ego that Buddhism talks about. Just to give you a few examples to better illustrate this, a lot of times in our life, we look for information that supports a way that we already think, for example. Like we might have a certain worldview, we might think about things in a certain way, and we search and seek out information that supports that pre-existing opinion. Or for example, we have pride, right? So when we make a mistake, when we fall short on something, when we fail, we look for an outside excuse other than blaming ourselves. It's their fault that this happened. It's not me. It's the world that was against me. Oh, the universe conspired against me. Oh, I have these disadvantages in my life. Or I don't know, my jungler was feeding or something like that. And when in reality, we don't always realize that we're thinking dishonestly. We're not really looking at ourselves and trying to be objective about things. So what this is saying is be as objective as possible. Don't let your ego, don't let your pride or your feelings get in the way or cloud your judgment of seeing things clearly. What Musashi is basically saying here is that if you're not being honest with yourself at all times, you are basically doing yourself a disservice, and it might end up hurting you without you realizing it. Let's just use him as an example really quick. If at any point he decided, you know what, I'm the best duelist in the world, I don't even need to train anymore, or I have no room for improvement, I'm already perfect, he might have died. So again, what he's saying here is clear your mind of ego, clear your mind of pride, don't think dishonestly, always seek the truth even if it hurts you. Number 2, the way is in training. So there are 2 ways that I see of interpreting this. So one of them is a little more straightforward and practical. The other one is a little more philosophical. The first one that's a little more practical and straightforward, what you probably assume when you first read this is he's saying never stop training. Always dedicate yourself to training. Never think that you're the best. Always keep at it. Number 2 is a different interpretation here, but I know this because of just having overall read the Book of Five Rings. Not only this teaching, is that Musashi kind of believed in getting to heaven, reaching nirvana through his training. It is believed that you can reach Satori or Nirvana in Buddhism by different ways, and one of those ways is just completely grounding yourself and focusing heavily on just one thing, mastering that one thing. Because if you're just focused on training or on your craft or the one thing that you're doing, you're not thinking about lusting, you're not thinking about money, you're not thinking about anxiety and worry and all these different things that cloud our judgment per se. That's why Buddhist people meditate so much. They're trying to clear their mind, and losing yourself in your craft or in an art, a lot of the writings that he did or paintings or the art of the sword is one way to achieve that. It's not only what immediately meets the eye here with what he's saying, where, the way is in training. The only way to get good at your craft is by training. That's not all that he means. What he's also trying to share here with you is how to achieve Satori, how to achieve Nirvana, how to get to heaven, basically. That's what he's trying to share with you here. It's very beautiful what he's trying to teach you here. Even if you don't agree, I don't care if it's your religion or it isn't, your philosophy or it isn't. I'm just saying, he's basically trying to teach you how to get rid of suffering. He's trying to teach you how to get to heaven, which, in my opinion, is very beautiful. Number 3, become acquainted with every art. So again, there is the straightforward, you can probably figure out what he means just by looking at it, and there is the more philosophical meaning behind this as well. Why is it that from a practical standpoint, it's important to become acquainted with every art? Well, because if you're a master of the sword, for example, but you don't know how a spear works or the weaknesses and strengths of that weapon, you're going to get killed, so you should probably understand how that weapon works too. It's great that you know how to read, but you probably want to learn how to write. You might want to learn how to paint. You might want to learn how to do other things. He's basically telling you on a practical sense, you probably want to expand your horizons. The more you know, the more versatile of a person and a warrior you can be. The more you can adapt and the more you can anticipate what your enemy is going to be doing. That's the practical interpretation, in my opinion. The more philosophical interpretation of this would be that there is more than meets the eye. There is probably more out there than just what you know. So stay humble about the fact that you probably don't know everything. And it's not just because you think there is only one way to live or there is only, one thing that matters in this world that there aren't other things that you might not be acquainted with or aware of that are also important. Basically saying, don't be stubborn, broaden your horizons. There is more to life than just what meets the eye. Number 4, know the ways of all professions. Pretty much the same principle. Number 3 and number 4 could be interpreted in a similar way, but it's the same thing. You got to know all the professions, meaning you got to know how the bow works, you got to know how the spear works, you got to know how the sword works. There are multiple interpretations that this could have, but generally speaking, it's very similar to 3. Don't be stubborn, broaden your horizons for any number of reasons. Number 5, distinguish between gain and loss in worldly matters. So number 5 is very straightforward and practical. This entire section of the book is supposed to deal with worldly concerns, practical matters, right? The entire book is very philosophical, but this part is supposed to be more straightforward. These principles are supposed to teach you how to live wisely and live in reality. Be a practical person and not let ego and judgment get in the way, just thinking clearly. And that's what he means here. He's saying assess situations wisely, understand value and risk. Everything that you're doing is going to have an action and a consequence. When you're deciding to take on an enemy or, send your troops to war or whatever it is that is in the context of the life that he's living, you should think practically. Are you on a campaign of vengeance? Are you doing this because of your pride or your ego or because you got insulted by someone or something like that? Or does it actually make sense to do what you're doing? When he's saying distinguish between gain and loss in worldly matters, he's saying be able to determine without your ego, without your pride getting in the way, is this a W or is this an L? Did you actually win here? Did you actually lose here? Why did you win? Why did you lose? Is this actually beneficial or would it not be beneficial? Think clearly regardless of how you feel. Musashi is one of the original facts don't care about your feelings, which that's what Buddhism is all about, which is why I tend to identify a lot with Buddhism personally. Number 6, develop an intuitive judgment and understanding for everything. What he's saying here, in my opinion, is twofold, because he first says develop an intuitive judgment. So what he's saying is that as you learn and as you grow, develop a judgment and don't rely on everybody for everything. Don't always rely on a leader. Don't always rely on a teacher. Don't always rely on a book. Try to rely on yourself also based on the things that you've observed. Also, use your gut. Use what you know. But he's also saying develop an understanding for everything. So what he's saying is don't just accept something as is. Oh, it is the way it is. Like fire just exists. I don't get how it works, but it just exists. No, try to understand it. When you break things down and you really try to understand the if and the whys of everything, you kind of understand the world in its essence. Like just giving you a practical example for something that many samurai had to deal with, right? And I'm sure Musashi did on a lot of his duels, especially on some of those duels which were against naginatas and spears. A thrusting motion, like a spear, will arrive in its target, the center mass, your stomach, a lot faster than a sword will. With that said also, when you perform a thrusting motion, there are certain muscles that are being used and there are certain positions that'll cause in movement in your body. So if you're in a duel with somebody and you understand how that motion works and what their weaknesses are and what their strengths are, it's easier to be able to fight against it, to counter it. He's basically saying, understand how things work and you'll be able to deal with them. I'm sure you've heard the expression that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? A big thing in Buddhism is that when you don't know things, that's where despair comes from. So I believe that that is in part what he's trying to say with number 6 here. So we move on now to number 7, perceive those things which cannot be seen. What he's saying here is basically recognize underlying truths beyond the visible. What he's saying is, again, this is a common theme in his principles. There's more than what just meets the eye. Recognize that it's not just because you don't see it that it's not there, right? If there's an elephant in front of you and you close your eyes, it doesn't really make the elephant go away, even though you don't see it. It's probably still there. I'm going to move on from this one because we've already talked about this a lot, but just using a straightforward, like, I don't know, scientific principle. Can you see gravity? No, but try to understand it because it's obviously there. It's not just because you can't see gravity per se that it's not there. It's a force. You can observe things around you that lead you to conclude that gravity is in fact a force that does exist. Something like that. Number 8, pay attention even to trifles. So what he's saying here, if you don't know what a trifle is, it's something that's of not much importance, something that it's a small detail, why should it matter type of thing. He's basically saying pay attention to the details. The truth or the things that you're seeking often lie in these details. He is of course not the only one to realize this. Oda Nobunaga certainly realized this as well. Sun Tzu from The Art of War certainly realized this as well. They used certain details, things that were considered mundane or things that were considered of not much importance in warfare or in strategy. They used that to their advantage. That's the idea, and a big thing in Buddhism is always remaining grounded. A big thing that Buddhist monks do is they pave the way because they don't want to step on bugs, for example. Everything is connected and important. You know, a rock, the cricket, a human, a tiger, the air, water, sun, moon, all of that is one and connected, and it all matters. That's what he's trying to say from a more practical standpoint and from a more philosophical approach as well, is that everything matters. Every little detail matters. Be present and take it all in. Even things that you might think are of little importance or are a small detail could be the key to unlocking some sort of question that you have or understanding something. That's kind of what he's getting at. Number 9, and the final principle is, do nothing which is of no use. He's basically saying avoid distractions, avoid these worldly concerns and these worldly things that we indulge in. He's basically giving us here very practical advice, right? This is why he never got married. That's why he didn't have kids. He wasn't a lustful guy. He was very detached from worldly things. In Buddhism, it's a very big thing that in order to ascend, in order to reach nirvana, satori and all that, you gotta detach yourself from these worldly pleasures and things. That's one of the aspects of this that I'm sure he definitely identifies with because of his own religion. But then there's the more practical advice, which it's literally just don't waste your time with things that don't add to your life. Like, why are you worrying about something that you have no control over? Why are you worried if somebody insulted you? Why are you wasting your time with this thing that has no use? He's basically telling you don't waste your time. He's probably saying that towards your goals as well. If you have a very specific goal in mind, don't let anything get in the way. And, you know, I think there's a caveat to this. I don't completely agree with him, but I get where he's coming from. The bottom line of what he's saying here is avoid actions that do not serve a purpose or aid one's goals. Musashi is insanely goal-oriented. Like, he only cares about one thing, and that's how he became the best at that one thing. I personally think that there's a lot more to life than just swordsmanship and art, but, you know, that's his philosophy, that's his religion, that's how he thinks. So these are the 9 principles contained in the Book of Earth, which are not by any means the only principles in the entire book. This is, again, the Book of Earth is very practical. It is in fact meant to complement another part of the book, which is the Dokudo. The Dokudo is a separate text that Musashi wrote towards the end of his life, so it's a different part of the book that specifically deals with the 21 spiritual principles. And these spiritual principles focus on self-reliance and detachment, which are a very Buddhist thing. The whole thing with Buddhism is detaching from your sense of self, right? The fact that you yourself, you don't matter. Only reality matters. Only what's practical matters. Some of the big ideas and principles in Buddhism is that we're constantly lying to ourselves. What, we're seeing is not really reality, and it urges people to look at everything practically. And frankly, it's not surprising to me that there would be a section of the book that deals just with spiritual principles, because even on the Book of Earth, that's supposed to be more practical and more earthly in nature. You can clearly tell, as I've expressed here, that there's a lot of Buddhist influence. Like, obviously Musashi is a Buddhist. Everything he's saying here, it's just well known in Buddhism. These are very well-known principles, and even though he's being objective with everything he's saying, based on what he thinks and the philosophy and the religion, you kind of know where he's coming from. And then when you put two and two together and you realize that all these principles of the Book of Earth are supposed to complement the Dokudo, which is the spiritual book, you really get where he's coming from. This whole idea of detachment, seeing beyond what meets the eye, being present, being self-reliant, being brutally honest with yourself, ignoring your ego, realizing that we tell lies to ourselves. All of these principles and all of his philosophy in general is very Buddhist in nature, and if you're familiar with it, it's pretty easy to tell where he's getting it from. I'm not trying to debate with anybody or argue whether or not the philosophy is right or whether it's good or bad. I'm not interested in that. I'm just sharing with you where the guy's coming from because I'm familiar with those teachings. And that is the story of the legendary Miyamoto Musashi. Thanks for watching.